From the American Academy of Pediatrics.
When children are expelled from preschool or childcare, the results can be devastating.
And the rates of expulsion amplify existing inequities.
Many of those kids dislike school later. They're much more likely to be school dropouts. And there is even a correlation between incarceration later in life and early preschool expulsion.
Plus, new research shows substantially higher rates of homelessness for sexual minority youths in unsupportive states.
As acceptance for homosexuality increased by 20 percentage points, we found nearly a 7 percentage point decrease in the likelihood that a sexual minority would be homeless.
These stories and more on Pediatrics on Call, the podcast on children's health from the AAP. I'm Dr. Joanna Parga-Balinki.
And I'm Dr. David Hill. This podcast is for everyone in the medical community, keeping our children healthy and safe.
It's a show by pediatricians for pediatricians.
But anyone who cares about kids will get a lot out of it as well.
Let's start today's episode with a conversation about the effects of preschool and childcare expulsion.
Joanna, how is Simon liking preschool?
He really enjoys it. I often find him walking around the house practicing his phonics, A, ah, B, ba, and he talks about his friends and how well-behaved everyone is in class, which is kind of comical, especially if they're not well-behaved. So it's fun for his parents as well, just to watch him learn and grow both academically and socially.
And can you imagine now what you would do if he got expelled?
Expelled? Oh, honestly, I cannot. I'm not sure how we would actually go to work or how we would keep on top of his learning. It would be a disaster for all of us.
Well, I've been lucky enough never to have to answer that question myself, but my wife, Christy, cares for children with psychiatric and behavioral health challenges, and some of the families in her practice are dealing with preschool expulsion frequently. It's heartbreaking.
I can imagine, because it's so hard for families to access services in developmental and behavioral pediatrics or psychology and psychiatry. And it's hard to ask a preschool teacher to also be a behavioral therapist. This is a really thorny question.
It is, but today's guest, Dr. Gail Williams, might be able to help us find some roses among the thorns. She is co-author of a new policy statement addressing early education and child care expulsion.
Dr. Williams is a developmental behavioral pediatrician at the Norton Child Development Center at the University of Louisville, as well as a professor of pediatrics and program director of the Developmental and Behavioral Pediatrics Fellowship there. Gail, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It's my pleasure to be here.
Well, it's our pleasure to have you. And Gail, I have to admit that I hear a lot of anecdotes from my wife or families that I care for in practice, but I really don't know the true scope of this issue. What do we know about how many children are expelled from preschool or childcare?
Well, I think the fact of the matter is we probably do not have a good idea of how many children are suspended or expelled from childcare and even public preschool programs. In many instances, the expulsions are not reported. There are no records unless they are public programs. And just as you said, we know from anecdotal data that many private daycares are not very tolerant of poor behavior on the part of preschoolers and dismiss those children without it ever being recorded. And I think that, again, we don't know the scope exactly, but we know that it is a huge problem and that it often reflects the inequities of our society, because there are risk factors for children being suspended and expelled.
And to get more into those risk factors, we know that high-quality childcare can be helpful with child development. What happens to these children and their families when they're expelled from early childhood education programs?
Well, in many instances, it has pretty significant long-term consequences. I think the most important of those is the children who get expelled or suspended don't have their basic problems recognized. They don't get the treatment that they need. They don't have the opportunity to learn those social emotional skills, which are going to serve them well in later school settings. And there is data to support that many of those kids dislike school later. They're much more likely to be school dropouts. And there is even a correlation between incarceration later in life and early preschool expulsion. So it really is significant in its implications.
Do you suspect, Gail, that expulsions from private daycares or preschools are higher than public? And is there a reason for that?
I do strongly suspect that expulsions from private daycare programs are much higher than for public. Many of the preschoolers in public education programs are there because there is funding through the IDEA Act because of either their behavioral or developmental concerns. The IDEA Act, which is the Individual with Disabilities Education Act, sets forward the fact that all children are entitled to an appropriate educational program. And there is federal funding set aside for preschoolers who have developmental disabilities and or significant social emotional difficulties to receive preschool services beginning at age 3. So, again, many of the kids in preschool settings may have qualified on the basis of their developmental disability, and that is taken into consideration. And so I think there certainly is some effort made to keep those kids in preschool and to record whether they stay in preschool or not, whereas in private daycare programs, they're much less tolerant. They can certainly make the rule that if the child's not toilet trained, he's not going to be able to attend preschool or daycare. So, yes, I think that there is a much higher rate.
I want to bring up an enormous equity question. We've talked on the podcast before about how Black children are often viewed as older than their actual chronological age and therefore expected to be developmentally more mature. When it comes to preschool expulsion, are we seeing children of color being expelled due to this misconception?
Absolutely. The inequities of our society are mirrored in the preschool expulsion rates. Black boys in particular are about 3.5 times more likely to be expelled than their white counterparts. Males in particular are much more likely, about 4.5 times, to be expelled than females. And I think you're exactly right. The expectations and the bias that is probably unconscious, implicit in nature, is there and is reflected in expulsion rates. Another risk factor, and a significant one, is developmental disabilities. Kids with developmental disabilities, whether it be communication problems or ADHD, perhaps not diagnosed, anxiety in preschoolers. This starts in early preschool years, but again, is often not recognized as a factor in these children's behavior and results in expulsion just because of disruptive behavior. Another one is exposure to trauma. Kids who have experienced adverse early childhood experience, whether it be poverty, mental health issues in parents, food insecurity, safety issues in their community, they are at marked increased risk for being expelled from school.
And when thinking of how we can stop preschool expulsions from happening, where should the focus be? On families, teachers, through pediatricians? How do we share this responsibility to help children achieve supportive early learning environments?
This is a great question. And I think you're pointing to all these shared caregivers. It has to be a collaboration. It really does. And certainly we need for our child caregivers, our early educators to be trained, to know about early child development, to not misinterpret behaviors, and to know how to deal with those behaviors. So that's critical. We also need things like smaller class sizes, better pay for those preschool teachers, help with their burnout when it happens, because that's a challenging profession that is not always given the credit that it should be. So certainly that is a factor. Obviously, communities need to do their part in providing safe community venues for kids to socialize, whether it's libraries, museum, play activities, or whatever. So that's another critical role. And this policy statement really focused on the role of pediatricians in that goal of preventing preschool expulsions. Most pediatricians would tell you that they spend much of their day working with kids who have developmental and behavioral concerns.
I want to follow up on that because I know that our listeners are going to want to take action. Are there things that we can do in our office encounters that can help families facing this issue?
Absolutely. And I think, many pediatricians are already doing this, but just to point to some of the things that we can do, I think we are the ones that develop that partnership with families and who parents often come to advise them on disciplinary strategies and so on. As the first goal, I think we can model and encourage positive parent-child relationships. And that is so important, especially for new parents or for parents who perhaps haven't had the luxury of a positive experience growing up. How to enjoy your child, how to be positive in your interactions with your child, to create activities and not to resort to punitive strategies for discipline. The only way time out works is if time in is fun. If there's a reward to time in. And, for some kids, that's not the case. They unfortunately get a lot of negatives rather than positives. So modeling that and encouraging those kinds of relationships for families is one way. We also do now so much screening for developmental problems that may arise through our surveillance and screening, but also for some of those toxic stressors which are going to impact development, behavior, health down the road, and so on. So that is a critical role. And once children have been identified as having those risk factors, referring families to appropriate resources, getting them in the programming that's going to meet their needs, helping families find those programs which, are going to help their child, whether it's mental health consultation or daycare programs or early education programs, which are going to be helpful for their child. So, those are just a few of the ways that pediatricians play a tremendous role in this effort.
And if we think of pediatricians as advocates, I know it's sometimes hard to find services for mental health and other things that you mentioned. If we want to work for change at local, state, or national levels, what should we be striving for?
Right. Well, we are always advocates, whether it's in the office or whether it's in the community or whether it's in a national level. As a developmental behavioral pediatrician, there are so few of us. I feel that we all have to be advocates, and that can involve consulting with daycare programs, finding out resources. I always encourage residents, when they are finding a new practice, to go out in the community and meet some of those providers who are going to be resources for families so that they really feel comfortable making recommendations. Certainly, and I know most pediatricians don't have a lot of extra time, but if you are able to take part in community events or community boards that are proponents of safe and nurturing environments for kids, that is also a wonderful venue. And then certainly being part of the AAP committees and councils and so on, where that is our goal, is to, be sure that we help children in the best possible way.
That is fantastic advice. And this is such a huge topic. We hope that everyone will read the policy statement for themselves. But is there a last takeaway you can leave us with?
I guess my main takeaway from this policy statement is that this is a team effort in preventing preschool expulsion. And it fits into so many of the recommendations that we've seen from prior policy statements about toxic stressors and trauma-informed cares and early childhood brain development, that pediatricians have a significant role in helping prevent preschool expulsion through the work that we do every day with families, in screening children for developmental and behavioral problems, promoting positive parent-child interactions, pointing families toward resources in the community, helping develop quality daycare and preschool programs. So it reflects what pediatricians do on a daily basis to help families and children develop to their best abilities. And I think that's what we're all about as pediatricians. We want each child in our care to have the opportunity to blossom both developmentally and socially, emotionally. And again, I think we have a wonderful opportunity as pediatricians to partner with families to make this come true.
Well, relationships are the backbone of pediatrics. Dr. Gail Williams, thank you so much for joining us today.
Again, my pleasure. Thank you so much.
To read the policy statement addressing early education and childhood expulsion, go to aap.org/podcast.
Coming up, we'll look at rates of sexual minority youths and homelessness and how their intersection affects health outcomes. You know, Joanna, I used to be a news junkie, but lately I have to limit my consumption for the sake of my mental health.
Yeah, I recall there was a lecture on climate change and youth mental health at this year's National Conference and Exhibition. And I have to admit that as a mother of young children, the news just made me really anxious, and other news does that too.
I know, but even though we might find it uncomfortable, it's interesting to draw connections between headlines and the health of children we care for. Here's an example. Could the backlash against improved support and rights for LGBTQ plus people be worsening the crisis of homelessness?
Oh, that is interesting. But how do we begin to answer a question like that?
Well, we can't, but we can talk to someone who studies these topics, like Dr. Gilbert Gonzalez. He's an associate professor at the Center for Medicine, Health, and Society, the Program for Public Policy Studies, and the Department of Health Policy at Vanderbilt University.
Right. And he's also co-author of a new study in pediatrics, Homelessness Among Sexual Minority Youth. Dr. Gonzalez, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Your study looks at the interface between two potential factors that increase health risks for young people. Can we start with sexual minority status? What do we know about the risks faced by LGBTQ plus young people?
So sexual minorities continue to experience discrimination and stigma and bullying in schools. And what we know is that this leads to worse health outcomes, worse mental health outcomes, increased substance use disorders and behaviors. They're more likely to engage in cigarette smoking or alcohol consumption as a response, as a coping mechanism to the discrimination and stigma that they're already facing. And so that's what we know broadly about LGBTQ health disparities. And this happens across the life course, but it begins in youth and adolescence.
And then what about the risks faced by youths who are experiencing homelessness?
Youth experiencing homelessness are a very vulnerable population. They are either kicked out of their homes or their families are experiencing housing insecurity. And if they're alone, what many of us worry about is that they're struggling to survive and they may have to engage in risky behaviors like survival sex to survive day to day. They may, as a coping mechanism, also engage in adverse health behaviors like heavy drinking, trying new drugs, or using tobacco products. And unfortunately, we still see that many parents still disown their LGBTQ adolescents and young adults.
Oh, that's hard to hear. And these are very tough topics to study. What question did you hope to answer, and where did you find the data you needed to answer it?
Right. So we were interested in just documenting homelessness and types of homelessness among sexual minority youth and whether public policy or public attitudes on homosexuality were associated with homelessness. And for that, we drew data from the CDC's Youth Risk Behavior Survey. And this is a survey that's conducted across all 50 states and the District of Columbia and in high schools, in random high schools, grades 9 through 12. A random class in a certain period of the day is selected for survey participation, and students are asked about their health behaviors. And we decided to use this because this is the best available, most timely, nationally representative data set that we could find.
And how did you define sexual minority youths in the data set that you used for this study?
So in this study, we used self-reported information about each high school student's sexual orientation. How did they identify themselves as heterosexual or gay, lesbian, bisexual, or something else? And for those latter groups, those are what we consider sexual minorities, those youth who do not identify as heterosexual.
And then finally, homelessness. How did you figure out which youths were unhoused?
Great question. And so in the data set, in the YRBS, the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, they asked students in the past 30 days, did you not live at home? And were you living with a family or friend? Were you living in a park, in a hotel, in a shelter? And we used that measure to identify those who were experiencing houselessness, homelessness, and housing insecurity.
Now, the independent variable here was different states' environments for sexual minority youth. How did you assess that?
To assess the variation across states in terms of public policies and in terms of acceptance of homosexuality, we drew data from two different sources. First, we used data from the Movement Advancement Project, or MAP, which collects information on public policies affecting LGBTQ populations. And so they document whether there are hate crime laws that would protect LGBTQ people. They identify whether kids can get bullied in school based off of their sexual orientation or gender identity. And they summarize this using a policy score or a policy index that can be either negative or positive, suggesting that the state is anti-LGBT or affirming LGBT. The second data source to measure cultural stigma, and I think this is a new area of research, is that we know that structural discrimination can be measured through policy, but there's a rising literature on cultural stigma and discrimination, on attitudes and acceptance of certain populations. And so for this, we use data from Pew, where adults in all 50 states were asked, do you accept homosexuality, or should homosexuality be accepted? Yes or no? And we use that percent of adults saying that they do accept homosexuality and it should be accepted as an indicator of better attitudes for sexual minorities in those states.
So you have reliable data on what youth would be part of a sexual minority, on who is experiencing homelessness, and on how these states view and protect or fail to protect sexual minority youths. What did you actually find in these relationships?
So what we found is that in terms of the relationship between sexual minority identity and homelessness, public policy was not really a strong indicator or protective factor for preventing homelessness among sexual minority youth. Interestingly, what we found is that the greater the acceptance of homosexuality in a state, meaning more people were affirming of sexual minorities, the less likely that LGBTQ, but with a focus of sexual minority youth, they were less likely to be homeless in those states. So more specifically, as acceptance for homosexuality increased by 20 percentage points, we found nearly a 7 percentage point decrease in the likelihood that a sexual minority would be homeless. And if I can give an example, one example would be that compared to Wisconsin, a LGBTQ youth in Arkansas is about 7% more likely to end up experiencing homelessness. Again, compared to an LGBTQ youth in Wisconsin.
So a lot seems to hinge on state policy here. And for pediatricians who want to help improve this situation, are there policies we should be advocating for?
Well, if we're finding that policies are not as strong of a protective factor as attitudes and acceptance, I think what pediatricians could do is have those open conversations and dialogues with families and with parents in clinics, and when you're meeting with families in the patient rooms. And if a parent has some concerns about their child being a sexual minority, pointing them to proper resources and helping them inch towards acceptance and affirmation. And one example that I would recommend is the Family Acceptance Project that has brochures for parents to better understand sexual orientation and gender identity when they are struggling with it themselves.
So I want to repeat that because I feel like it's so important, Dr. Gonzalez. It's the Family Acceptance Project. And I know feeling like I could make a difference in the exam room right there in front of a family and a patient, and maybe keep a young person in the home, makes me feel incredibly empowered and hopeful. Do you have any last takeaways for our listeners before they go read this paper?
The last thing I would say is that we also looked at what types of homelessness were sexual minority youth experiencing compared to their heterosexual homeless counterparts. And what we found is that homeless sexual minorities were more likely to be staying in a shelter, in a hotel, or living on the streets, rather than with another family member or a friend compared to their heterosexual peers. And what that tells me is that we need to make sure that our emergency housing shelters are affirming of LGBTQ identities, and making sure that shelters and social service providers are affirming and accepting of LGBTQ youth and making those environments safe for LGBTQ youth to live in.
Dr. Gilbert Gonzalez, thank you so much for talking with us today about this important work.
Great. Thank you for having me.
To read the paper, Homelessness Among Sexual Minority Youth, go to aap.org/podcast. At the end of every episode, we like to leave you with something positive or enlightening. We call this segment Say Ah. David, what's your Say Ah this week?
Well, Joanna, we are still kind of caught up in something not positive or enlightening, which is my wife's stepfather's recent death. However, I always like to find the positive and enlightening side to these things. And so her sister and brother-in-law were just visiting us for 5 days to help out with this process. And, I don't know my brother-in-law all that well, but the more time I spend with him, the more time I really respect him and enjoy his company. So it wasn't a great reason to gather family together, but it was wonderful to be with family in such a difficult time.
And I'm so glad you have that togetherness, David.
Yeah, thanks. How are things going for you?
So for us, my Say Ah is we just bought a minivan, David.
Yes,
And for some people,
I
that
had
might be
two
a
at
say,
one point.
ooh. You had two? Oh, so
Yeah,
you're not one
matching.
of the say oohs. Okay, good. I mean, I am not a car person, and my husband is really happy about it. So I think it's a win. It's definitely
absolute
positive,
win. They're better than anyone knows who hasn't driven one. That's it for today's episode. If you like Pediatrics on Call, please subscribe on your favorite podcast app and help us spread the word. Follow us on Facebook and Instagram at Pediatrics on Call.
Pediatrics on Call is a production of the American Academy of Pediatrics. Our producer and editor is Ann Johnsos. Our audio engineer is Doug Nagel. Joe Puskars is our associate producer, and Susan Martin is our executive producer. Our theme music was composed by Matthew Simonson. We're off next week for a little Thanksgiving break, but we'll be back in December for First Up with Dr. Alex Kemper.
We'll also talk to Dr. Sophie Bach about new policy on preventing excessive noise exposure. I'm Dr. David Hill.
And I'm Dr. Joanna Parga-Balinki. Thanks for listening.